Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. More than 100 people are reported killed in strikes across Gaza as the United Nations warns there's a growing risk of famine. Hopes for a new ceasefire as an Israeli delegation holds talks in Paris to try and secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. Western leaders show support in Kyiv as the war in Ukraine enters its third year. And furious French farmers storm a major agricultural show in Paris before a planned visit by President Macron. More than 100 people are reported to have been killed in overnight strikes in Gaza, including at least 24 at a shelter for displaced people in Deir el-Balah. It comes as the United Nations warns of an impending famine in Gaza, saying that aid agencies need unrestricted access to the territory. Meanwhile, the southern city of Rafah is preparing itself after Israel restated its threat to launch a ground assault. Our correspondent Akram Al-Satari reports from Gaza.
Well, people are extremely worried. That can be seen and observed through their different movements out from Rafah city towards the area between Khan Yunis and Rafah. That can also be seen through the large-scale relocation from areas in Rafah that are expected to be part of the imminent ground operation in the area. People have been following the news. People have been hoping that a ceasefire would be reached before this ground operation is a reality. However, it looks like the bombardment is still ongoing in Rafah, and people perceive that ongoing bombardment that has been intensified for the last couple of days or so as part of the ground operation, and they think that the Israeli occupation is paving the way towards a larger action that includes a ground operation in area Rafah. So people still stay confused, still stay worried, still stay afraid because of that ongoing activity, and that's why they have been trying to secure whatever food supplies they can. They have been trying to secure blankets. The ones that have some tents that were removing those tents and moving to some area that they think would be safe. So the general and overall feeling of unsafety has been haunting the people in Rafah, and it's still haunting them.
And you talk then about securing food and water. We've had the United Nations warning about potential famine. How hard is it for people to get hold of food and water?
Well, I think the famine has already hit the Gaza Strip. Some of the stories and some of the evidence reports that are coming from the Gaza North and Gaza South alike are indicative of some horrors that people have been seeing, are indicative of some people dying because of the cold and because of the hunger, have been also indicative of the fact that people are suffering from thirst because they don't have adequate water. The UN quote, the UN words were saying that there's no adequate food or water supplies for the people of Gaza, and that is likely to bring about a famine. Some areas have no water or food at all. Some people were harvesting or collecting the rainfall for the sake of just drinking a water that is safe. Some people have been developing public diseases, abdominal diseases, skin diseases because of the ongoing deprivation from almost everything. The situation is extremely bad.
As the Israel-Gaza conflict continues, mediators are trying to reach a ceasefire deal. An Israeli delegation is in Paris for meetings with Qatar, Egypt and the United States after Hamas officials ended their round of negotiations on Friday. The meeting comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu outlined his plans for complete post-war control of Gaza, a plan rejected by Palestinian leaders. David Biller is the Associated Press correspondent in Jerusalem.
So there was some cautious optimism this week. We saw in the lead-up to the meeting in Paris, the War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz saying that there were signs of progress. We also heard similar things from a Western diplomat and an Egyptian official who said they saw encouraging signs. The Egyptian official in particular said that both parties had watered down their demands due to the help from the mediators. That included the number of prisoners that Israel would release, number of Palestinian prisoners. As you may remember, Israel walked away from original negotiations, or the most recent round of negotiations, because of demands that Netanyahu characterized as delusional, and that included the release of thousands of prisoners. Now, the Egyptian official told us that an understanding was reached with Hamas for a ceasefire deal that would last 6 weeks, with release of elderly and sick hostages as well as Palestinian prisoners. They were going to present that understanding to the Israeli side in Paris. We need to see what exactly comes from that. It would have to be evaluated by the Israeli War Cabinet. We've seen some really recent reports from local press, positive signs from that returning delegation, but we need to see, we haven't yet confirmed that, and I would just, caution that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Yesterday, a Hamas official, Osama Hamdan, he really threw cold water on a bit of this optimism, saying that there were still significant obstacles to reaching any ceasefire deal.
And then we've had this plan outlined by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the future of Gaza, rejected by Palestinian leaders. What's been the reaction in Israel?
Right, so just to step back a second, this was really the first time that Netanyahu has formally presented a plan for post-war Gaza. It was a short outline. It really was just over a page. And as you mentioned, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry rejected this pretty quickly, saying that it amounted to, or it would amount to, reoccupation of Gaza. The response in Israel, aside from the Palestinian Authority, has been fairly muted. That may be because, some of these positions that Netanyahu outlined have been proposed by him in the past, but this was really the first time he'd put it, in writing in a formal document. It obviously does not satisfy the desire of the Israeli far right that would, quite loudly, as I said, it wants to resettle Gaza.
Canada and Italy have both signed new 10-year bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. The leaders of the two countries are among those in Kyiv as the country marks the second anniversary of Russia's military offensive. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has agreed to send over $2 billion in financial and defence aid over the next decade. Italy's leader, Giorgia Meloni, has told Ukraine's President Zelensky that peace cannot mean surrender to Moscow. Our correspondent Megumi Lim is in Kyiv.
Well, that's right. As you mentioned, the leaders of Italy, Canada, Belgium, and the president of the EU Commission are here today in Kyiv in a show of solidarity and support for Ukraine as the country marks 2 years of war with Russia. And they are going to be holding a meeting, a virtual meeting, which will include the leaders of Germany and France as well. Macron and Scholz will be joining via video link. And we're expecting them to be discussing more security cooperation with Ukraine as the country enters its third year of war against Russia. They will be discussing further military and financial assistance for Ukraine and also more sanctions against Russia. Now, the details of the discussions we have yet to find out in a few hours once the meeting wraps up. But we have seen reports that they are expected to adopt a declaration at the end of the meeting, which will include obviously a strong condemnation against Putin and his ongoing aggression against Ukraine. It will also state that Putin has not achieved his goals so far in Ukraine, and it would also call on Russia to withdraw fully and unconditionally his forces from Ukraine. We're also seeing reports that this declaration will also include a pledge that the participating countries signing this declaration will not recognize any elections that Russia will hold now or in the future in the occupied territories of Ukraine.
OK, so financial assistance, one of the things on the agenda for the G7 then. When it comes to funding for Ukraine, is Europe united on continuing their support?
Yes, largely the EU has overall remained united in terms of its solidarity and support for Ukraine. Just earlier this month, the EU pledged 50 billion euros in macro financial support for Ukraine. This is part of the Ukraine Facility program. That is, the funds will be disbursed from this year till 2027. Now, the question is, are these funds enough? The IMF has said that Ukraine's funding gap is expected to amount to about $40 billion in this year alone. And of course, Ukraine has managed to stay afloat, although its economy was devastated during the first year of the war, but it has managed to bounce back thanks to the financial assistance that's been provided by its Western partners. But how sustainable the funds are going to be, it remains a question. Now, in terms of EU unity, we have also seen Hungary block in the past further aid for Ukraine. Hungary has voiced that it would not support more aid for Ukraine in the future, and Slovakia has also in the past backed Hungary in terms of this statement. So there are also concerns that Hungary and Slovakia may in the future again become a stumbling block in terms of EU disbursing more funds for Ukraine. And also we have to remember that the EU has been no match with the United States in terms of military aid. The US has still been the biggest donor of weapons and arms to Ukraine, and as we know, the additional military aid for Ukraine has remained stuck in Congress since December, and US officials have been sounding the alarm more and more that Ukraine may be facing catastrophic consequences by late March in terms of shortages of critically needed ammunition and artillery shells if the US Congress doesn't approve more aid for Ukraine.
There's been no comment from the Kremlin so far about the anniversary, as our correspondent Dasha Chernysheва reports from Moscow.
Well, the Kremlin has remained silent, providing no comment on the 24th of February 2024, which is indeed the second anniversary since the start of Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. However, we have heard from several Russian politicians, including the presidential candidates, Leonid Slutsky, the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, suggesting that this operation was inevitable, and the 2 years since the conflict started are only proving that. We also have heard another candidate for the Russian president, Davankov, suggesting that he wishes to the Russian people the peaceful sky as soon as possible. But largely, the Russian politicians have all been talking about the inevitability of this conflict between Russia and the West. This is how it is largely described here in Russia. At the same time, we heard the Russian Ministry of Defense confirming that the Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has traveled to the area of the special military operation. He has listened to the reports of the center grouping of forces. He was briefed about the ongoing situation there and praised the work of the soldiers who captured Avdiivka. In his words, he was shown the military equipment provided by the Western countries to Ukraine, and that appears to be inferior to the Russian one. He was also briefed that while taking Avdiivka, the Russian forces have managed to push back the Ukrainian soldiers by over 2 kilometers, and over 200 prisoners of war have been captured as a result of this latest development on the ground. The Russian defense minister also said that those prisoners have to be treated humanely.
And Dasha, new sanctions against Russia announced by both the United States and the EU. Has there been any reaction to those from Moscow?
Well, we have heard Moscow saying that all those sanctions are the so-called anti-Russian agony because they do not change Russia's course on the ground. All those sanctions, from what we hear from the Russian officials, have not managed to cripple the Russian economy. Now, we have heard in 2022 that the wave of sanctions that has been imposed against Russia would cripple the Russian economy. That did not happen. In 2023, the energy sanctions were supposed also to collapse the Russian budget. That did not happen. So now Moscow insists that this is not the case and that all those sanctions that the West is trying to impose against Russia will not work, and these attempts to meddle into the Russian domestic affairs, as Moscow sees those, will not yield those results. Having said that, obviously Russia has to redirect and transform its economy. A lot has been done in terms of restructuring the Russian industrial output, and many areas that have long been underdeveloped are now being developed. But at the same time, the inflation in Russia is growing. It is quite significant, and Russians do feel that those sanctions are in place.
Around a third of Ukrainians have fled the country over the last 2 years, according to the United Nations. After an initial exodus, large numbers went back home, but an estimated 6.5 million people remain outside Ukraine. And many made Germany their temporary home, as our correspondent Natalie Carney reports.
Ukrainians are living under temporary protection in Germany, such as 33-year-old Katarina, who arrived nearly 2 years ago with her 9-year-old son. Thanks to the support of the NGO SpaceEye, she has been able to find accommodation and work. Back in the Ukraine, she worked as an intensive care nurse.
There was a very large shortage of nurses in Germany, and that my profession is in great demand here.
SpaceEye connected her to a local hospital in the Bavarian city of Regensburg, where she now works as a nursing assistant while learning German.
We're not working as full-time nurses yet, of course, because we need to confirm our diplomas. But we see how work is organized in Germany. We can also communicate with patients and colleagues in German, thereby improving our German and learning it faster.
This has definitely helped her and her son, who is attending both German and Ukrainian schools, settle in.
I'm only thinking about confirming my diploma and trying to stay here. I really like Regensburg and I really like the hospital. My son has said that he doesn't want to go back, so we'll do our best to stay and to integrate fully.
But Katarina is in the minority. According to the IFO Center for Migration Research, there's growing pessimism among Ukrainian refugees about when the conflict will end. However, the vast majority still want to return to their homeland, with many struggling to integrate in their host countries.
Ukrainian refugees in Eastern European countries, but also in some Western European countries like the Netherlands, majority of them are working, while in Germany it's only a minority. Part of the explanation for this is that in Germany it's more difficult to find some jobs without qualifications and without good German skills. And given that Germany also has more generous welfare benefits, then people can afford taking more time to look for a qualified job.
The integration process has been easier for children who attend German schools, says Pudvara.
Older people are more determined to go back to Ukraine than younger people, and I find it likely that when it comes to children who are currently going to schools, an even higher fraction of them will end up staying.
Ukrainian membership of the European Union is now more a case of when rather than if. But what's certain is that the conflict has already had a permanent impact on towns and cities right across the bloc, and on the Ukrainian families who have been forced to find a new life. Natalie Carney, CGTN in Regensburg.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Furious French farmers clash with police after they storm a major agricultural show in Paris.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity. Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. More than 100 people are reported killed in strikes across Gaza as the United Nations warns there's a growing risk of famine. Hopes for a new ceasefire as an Israeli delegation holds talks in Paris to try and secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. And Western leaders show support in Kyiv as the war in Ukraine enters its third year. Voters in the U.S. state of South Carolina are picking their Republican presidential candidate. Polls indicate that former President Donald Trump is on course for a resounding victory over rival Nikki Haley, despite the vote taking place in her home state. The victory would boost his chances of sealing the Republican nomination. Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther is in South Carolina.
Well, look, this is one of the very rare election days in the United States that actually falls on a Saturday. Polling areas here opened at 7 a.m. this morning, will close at 7 p.m. Tonight. And this is a very rare thing as well, that this is a Republican primary that is an open primary. What that means is that essentially all registered voters here in this state can vote in the Republican Party, with one exception. They can't if they've voted in the Democratic primary, but that's only 4% of the population. Now, we ask what gives Donald Trump the edge. That does not. That gives Nikki Haley potentially the possibility, as the former governor of the state, to maybe collect some Democratic votes, those who really don't want Donald Trump to be the candidate on the Republican side again. She, by the way, the former governor of this state, will be voting herself here this morning. She was the governor, after all, here for 6 years. She's been crisscrossing South Carolina over the last few weeks, seeing this as a state that she would like to win, but is very unlikely to do so. Her arguments, they've become a little bit more aggressive toward Donald Trump over the last few weeks. She says that he is too old to be the nominee for the Republican Party again. He has had too many scandals, and he has too many legal problems, indicted 4 times after all. But I think the main argument from Nikki Haley to still remain in this race is essentially this one. She says that she is the only one, according to quite a lot of polls, who could actually beat President Joe Biden when it comes to the general election. Now, Donald Trump, the former president, on his side, he was here in the state as well last night on election eve. His argument is this one, that Nikki Haley should not be in this race anymore. Essentially, he is pretty angry that after the first few defeats, and there have been 3 for her in primaries so far, that she is still remaining in the race, he says, is not called for, and he wants to concentrate already on what everybody essentially expects to be a repeat of the duel between Joe Biden and Donald Trump when it comes to the presidential election.
A group of French farmers have stormed a major Paris agriculture fair before a planned visit by President Emmanuel Macron. The farmers clashed with police inside the trade show as they shouted for Macron's resignation. France is one of several EU countries where farmers have staged demonstrations in recent weeks amid anger over mounting costs and environmental regulations. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports from Paris.
Yeah, it was a very chaotic scene. You had these massed groups of people just pushing and shoving their way into the expo center here. They were clashing with police. At one point, the pushing and shoving was too much for one enclosure, which snapped under the pressure, sending a group of men tumbling into an animal pen. The French president wasn't present when this was all happening, but he did appeal for calm as the show was opening.
The fair must take place in a peaceful environment. I hear the frustrations, and I say this to all farmers. You are not helping any of your colleagues by breaking stalls. You are not helping any of your colleagues by making the fair impossible and scaring families from coming.
And so his words were actually met by heckles and calls for his resignation. Police had to disperse tear gas at one point. And you can just see that the anger is still very much boiling on the surface for these farmers, even weeks and weeks into these nationwide protests that we've seen about low salaries, rising costs, regulation concerns, what they believe to be unfair competition with cheap imports coming into the country. The French president is actually still here at the fair. This doesn't actually give you a very good representation, but it is a vast, vast area with many different halls where this expo is taking place. He is walking around through these different venues, and he is surrounded now by dozens and dozens of police officers because of these protests, something that we have not seen in years past.
At least 15 people have been killed and dozens more injured after a fire swept through an apartment building in the Chinese city of Nanjing. An initial investigation suggests that the blaze started on the first floor, where electric bicycles were being stored. 44 people were taken to hospital, and one is still in a critical condition. South Korea has raised its health alert to the highest level after a mass walkout by thousands of trainee doctors. They're protesting against a government plan to boost medical school admissions, which they say will compromise the standard of healthcare. The row has forced hospitals to turn patients away and cancel surgeries. Colombia has announced plans to retrieve lost treasure found on a Spanish galleon which sunk in the Caribbean more than 300 years ago. The ship was carrying emeralds, silver and gold worth billions of dollars when it sank in 1708 after an attack by the British Navy. Its wreckage was found just 9 years ago. Colombian officials say they'll use an underwater robot to explore the site and retrieve the artifacts. The mission's set to cost more than $4.5 million. Sonar pictures have revealed weaponry, ceramics and bronze cannons on board. China has officially named its 2 key spacecraft for a lunar mission planned by 2030. The manned spaceship has been called Mengzhou, which translates to dream vessel, and Lanyue, meaning one who embraces the moon, is the name of the lunar lander. The names were inspired by a 1965 poem by Chairman Mao. In a moment, my colleague Juliet Mann will be here with the agenda. In this week's show, The View from Africa, what the world's poorest continent needs to take its true place on the world stage. That's the agenda, right after the World Today at 16:30 GMT here on CGTN. The headlines again. More than 100 people are reported killed in strikes across Gaza as the United Nations warns there's a growing risk of famine. Hopes for a new ceasefire as an Israeli delegation holds talks in Paris to try and secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. And Western leaders show support in Kyiv as the war in Ukraine enters its 3rd year. And that is the World Today. Thank you for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. There's more news at the top of the hour, but for now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.